It was a quest, not a battle. And for this, One Wind hoped for a partner, not an opponent. There were 12 islands set into the great ocean archipelago on the seabed cliff called Marley's Ridge. As well as relying on each of the other landmass inhabitants for bartered goods and services, each one of the islands was connected in spirit and design to the others by the same created and displayed mosaic rosette inlaid into the soil on every isle. The tessellated rosette served as a meeting area for visitors and the islanders themselves. The rosette itself was a large blue moonstone and alternating complementary white pegmatite stone ring, about 120 hands in width, with a sand, clay, or tatami spherical center pit, about 90 hands in diameter. A muddler's meet takes place in the center of the rosette, sometimes referred to as the muddler's pit. There is one meet for each season: planting, growing, and harvesting. It is there where both partners prove to be worthy muddlers by stumbling their way through the muddle pit without rising above nor going below, just muddling. White Wave was considered the greatest muddler of all time. There had always been many great muddlers, but the skills of White Wave transcended the predilections and exaggerations of the ancients of the island inhabitants for past petty courage and minor accomplishments. White Wave had the heft of some 201 fist-sized stones with muscular legs like mountain spires and stout, sinewy arms like intertwined twining vine binds, dropping to his sides from a broad, wooden, water barrel-like chest. He acquired these attributes from his work both as a milliner and blacksmith, toiling daily with either millstones or sledgehammer and anvil, with caring and commitment, as if it were his last day of life on the isle, yet making sure his compassionate craftsmanship and all he touched, the creations of his hands, would be visibly viable and last 10,000 quarter moons. He always dressed in a black goat hair sackcloth robe, crocheted with whittled bamboo hooks and tinged raven black with ashes from the smithy fire pit. One Wind was an average-sized man with the frailish build of one who worked sitting as a bookbinder, all the while that the Empyrean orb candle illuminated his stone slab escritoire, until evening, when duskiness lay reclining o'er the isle. He labored slowly and obsessively, with one careful stitch at a time. The hands of the conservator displayed with the graceful lines of a hummingbird, with pointed needle and thread, and his fingers lifted in hovered flight as he connected together the paper signatures and then the text blocks of each storybook or tome. His own words were his way, his path in life, and he used them very sparingly. One Wind attired himself in a stiffly starched, loosely fitted dark blue cassock with a white surplice. He held his outfit together with what began as a pure white, thick and stiff cotton sash. Now, an unwashed gray, pendulous and frayed belt, double knotted at the energy center of his abdomen. The horror. This attire was meant to hide his scrawny legs and arms. Looking at him in his baggy clothing, one might be misled into thinking he was muscular and possibly wide. Or conversely, possibly not thin, nor even twig-like. White Wave was scheduled to participate in the first meeting, which was to take place during the planting season, and his unknown aspirant muddler was to be One Wind. The union was to come to pass on the Isla de Redención. It had been raining, so the Rosette Center consisted of a depth of 1 hand of sediment covered with a small finger joint of water. One Wind entered the Rosette Center first. He walked halfway to halfway of the annular center and stood waiting. White Wave entered from the opposite side. As White Wave was approaching the halfway to halfway point, he glanced down and noticed that his left sandal lace had come undone and was flapping in the mire. Before he could stop himself, his right foot stepped on the cord and he tottered, leaned, and fell forward. His knees hit first and sunk into the ooze, the full hand length, covering his kneecap and up to his thigh. Not being able to control the fall, his fists met the wet dirt and sunk into the sludge up to just above his wrists, until hitting terra firma. The ground shook with the might of his weight and strength, silt rising from the loam and sand and spattering all nearby. The tremors bounded through the islet homes, where books, bubbles, and kitsch fell from shelves. The shivering ground continued all the way to the ocean's edge, where it met the water. Whitecaps formed on the tips of the waves, clawing and crawling their way onto the shoreline, and then their nails dug into the sand, while the receding wave was sucked back into the ocean. When the trembling terrain and miscreant mud settled, White Wave lifted his head and looked up to find that One Wind was no longer where he once was. One Wind was flat on his back and passed out cold. A shaman, watching with passive scrutiny, approached and crossed the sodden field and placed a wispy down duck feather under the nose of One Wind. The quill shook slightly with the pulsing of the lungs pumping air in exhalation and inhalation like the foot bellows of a player piano. And the medicine man declared, "There is still breath." Moments later, One Wind slowly rose and walked dispassionately to the edge of the Rosette Center, stretched out his arms and hands and gestured gently to the sides in a signal to divide the gathered congregation. He then moved through the crowd and off of the Rosette. It seemed, from a slightly disparate perspective, as if the winnowing witnesses were maize tassels of a parting Red Sea, and One Wind was an evanescent ghost, passing through and vanishing into the beyond, as he pushed on, making his path through the mystery of the farmland. White Wave, now standing, was declared the muddler. For the next meeting, to take place during the growing season, both muddlers arrived on the Isla de un Amor, settled themselves, and found their way to the Rosette. One Wind once again walked to the quarter center of the two-dimensional sphere shape. White Wave walked onto the hallowed ground from a different radial point, drew his right hand back, and swatted at the air as if trying to brush aside a gnat distracting his line of refined vision, or perhaps to extinguish a meditation candle flame with the fanned winds whishing from his vast hand. Those who viewed this moment likened it to the sight of one hand clapping and awaited the sound. White Wave whirled, rotating on the ball of his left foot, and all around him the gusts gyrated, twisted, and picked up speed, forming 9 whirling dust dervish angels, foggy little cyclones comprised of air, drizzle, dust, and straw, each as tall as a semi-dwarf lemon tree. A light glaze of dust settled over the meeting rosette, and those nearby felt needle prickles of sand on their flesh. One Wind responded by approaching one of the dust angels, closing his eyes, and leaping with faith into the center. He was lifted 3 hands high and found himself floating like a seraphic being, resting inside the amorphous cloud of the dust angel, detritus swirling around him. She, the dust angel, held him aloft in her misty arms and comforted him. The third and final meeting was to take place during the harvest season on the Isla de Tres Payaros Pequeños. For this meeting, One Wind walked, while wobbling and hobbling aimlessly around the circle center with no clear direction or strategy in mind. White Wave walked purposefully and zealously to the midpoint of any diameter. He raised his fists, lifted his eyes and head to the heavens, and let loose with a cataclysmic roar, asserting, "I am the greatest muddler of all time." The earth cracked. The mountains crumbled. The seas muddied and air molecules collided, bouncing off of each other in chaotic fashion as if they were wandering vagrants vying for places on a 2-person park bench. One Wind waited detachedly while the seas cleared and the earth sealed, and the mountain stones rolled and tumbled into a dune like the sand in Papa's hourglass. And the molecules were ushered to their seats, 3 sitting snugly on a 2-person wooden settee. One Wind now stood in contemplation, with lips moving in constant motion, repeatedly, silently whispering his mantra without sound. Be still. Be still. after more than a moment, he looked up into White Wave's eyes and asked, with a meager breath, "Yes, but who are you?" With these words, every little thing changed. The cognition of all the discernment White Wave had grown to realize as his insight in life maturated to fruition in that wink of a wizard's eye. There was a change in the fires between a candle flame on a home altar and a supernova in space. There was a change in the waters between a teardrop being shed out of empathy and the ocean's depth of grace. There was a change in the earth between the alchemy of a black obsidian stone and a black hole in the cosmos. There was a change in the air between the breath of a barnacle and the wafting waves of the hurricane wind. There was a change in the sound between a whirring, whistling tea kettle and a spinning celestial planetary marble. There was a change in the energy between the core life force of Chi and the origin of it all. There was a change in the ether between the forefinger and the thumb, between now and then, between White Wave and One Wind, between White Wave and himself. In this new awareness, White Wave now held in his hand the numinous apperception that everything has an essence. He thought and asked, "Does an apple have an essence?" Yes. Does the wood from the tree that grows the apple have an essence? Yes. Does the dirt that the apple tree grows in have an essence? Yes. Every grain of sand has an essence. Does the stone that the tree roots cling to for balance and stability have an essence? Yes. Does the water from the stream that nourishes the tree and smooths the stone have an essence? Yes. Do I, White Wave, have an essence? Yes. And then, the potentially dank, unanswered questions from deep down in the weeping well rose up. What is the essence of everything? Is there a right essence? Is there a harmful essence? Can one be transformed as if from a callous, noxious cancer cell that still belongs to and is a part of you, to a healthy companion cell? Or must they endlessly coexist, hurtling toward immortal defeat, raucously to the point of silence? This brief moment of change, this scintilla of realization, could not be held in the palm of the hand of White Wave beyond the moment that it occurred. White Wave watched as it passed. To remember it and find it again, become to a deeper understanding, become unto nothing, he thought. This is the quest. One Wind walked to the inner edge of the rosette and stopped and waited. White Wave turned and followed, a step behind and then evenly, shoulder to hip. They stood beside each other at that inward-looking edge for what seemed like the passing of a full moon from one side of the aisle to the next. And then White Wave and One Wind glided, untethered, o'er the rosette, and drifted into their pilgrimage, chasing God down the boundless rails as partners.